In this video, I'm going to be discussing a phenomenon that I haven't really ever heard before. I've seen it depicted in cartoons and in movies, but never in a paranormal setting. So I'm going to go over that. But I kind of want to start with a case that I recently found on John Greenwald's amazing Black Vault site. It was May 6, 1991, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The witness, Bryden Temple, a pseudonym, was at home watching television. He recalled that ABC World News had just started, and around that time his dog started to growl. She seemed worked up by something, and Temple acknowledged that he'd never seen her behave like that before. Normally she was good-natured and playful, but on this night something was wrong. She jumped off the bed and went to the French door, with windows that led from the bedroom to the backyard. She didn't paw to go out. Instead, she sat down and kept growling and crying with her fur raised. She kept shaking her head. Curious about what was causing her to become so disturbed, Temple climbed out of bed and went to investigate. When he got to the door, he noticed a screeching, buzzing sound. He likened it to static. Just then the TV began to blink, and so did the lights. Something was interfering with his electricity, and whatever it was seemed to actually be hurting his dog. When I looked in the backyard, it was just beginning to get dark, but there was still some light out. In the distance above the treetops of the woods behind my house, I saw a circular light. It was hovering. I could tell it wasn't the moon or anything natural because it wobbled as it hovered. Temple noted that his dog was staring straight at it and growling viciously. I thought it was odd. I began to stare at it too. As I watched, it was as if I couldn't take my eyes away. Then I realized we were both unable to move. The static sound got louder, but my dog couldn't shake her head. We were frozen in place. I was terrified. I wanted to run, only I couldn't. The light changed direction. It fell down through the trees and took a path through the woods toward my house. It wove through the trees and got bigger and brighter. It hurt my eyes. It wasn't stopping. It came straight for my door about 6 feet off the ground. The light got so bright I thought my eyes would burn. Then it was just gone. I looked down at my dog. She was in exactly the same spot, drooling and growling, but softer now. I was dizzy and disoriented. It was as if the light passed straight through us. Temple sat down on the floor and tended to his dog. She fell over and laid still. She was panting as if she'd been running. The whole event seemed only a few seconds long until Temple looked over at the TV and saw that Wheel of Fortune was just wrapping up. In the time he and his dog were standing at that door, ABC World News, the local news, and Wheel of Fortune had aired. They had been standing there for a little under an hour and a half. I can't remember one thing during that time, Temple noted. Things would take an even stranger turn exactly 1 month later, when his dog vanished out of his backyard. I had to go out for a while. I left her outside. I had a 5-foot wooden fence around the yard. It was locked with a padlock. She wasn't a digger. I got home at about 9 p.m. and she was gone. The fence was locked. There was no fur on the ground. There were no holes in the yard. No one could have gotten over the fence with a 35-pound dog without a ladder. She was just gone. Temple was deeply bothered by the fact that his dog had vanished, and he wondered if her disappearance was somehow connected to the events of May 6th. In the weeks after the experience, Temple developed a severe rash all over his body. He also began to suffer from strange dreams, severe headaches, and a fear of sleeping at night. I have covered many cases involving people being taken with their pets, but this one I found interesting in that the animal, at least in this case, I think, might have been the focus of the being's interest. Initially, when I read the story, I assumed that the dog reacted the way it did because of its survival instincts. Though its reaction seemed to be of utter fear, it was not simply reacting to protect its master or its territory, it was afraid. I wonder if, in fact, the animal was afraid because it happened previously. It knew it was going to happen and it was scared. Granted, it might have also happened to Temple previously, and he simply suppressed it. But why then did the beings return and take the dog? Temple seemed pretty certain that the dog hadn't escaped by any natural means, and he doubted that somebody would actually put forth the effort to steal it. So where did it go? And why wasn't it brought back? We've all heard accounts of the visitors snatching up crops, cattle, livestock, elk, and even people. But I do sometimes wonder just how many animals in our world's forests, oceans, and even our own pets are taken. Might they be partially responsible for the shocking number of missing pets each year? Back on September 8, 2014, I listened to an episode of Darkness Radio with Dave Schrader and Tim Dennis. Around that time, as many of you know, and I discussed in the video thought form, anytime somebody would call in, I would try to make a note of it, the date, the location, etc. And if it was interesting or weird enough, I might actually transcribe it. On that night, a man named Nelson from Lakeview, Minnesota, called in to tell of something absolutely crazy he saw. It was actually so bizarre that I almost considered disregarding it. According to Nelson, one Saturday evening in October 2013, he was at a pub on the east side of West 7th in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was around 8 or 9 o'clock, and he was sitting at the bar, enjoying a drink, when he looked over and saw something completely crazy. I just happened to look on the other side of the bar, and I saw these little, kind of like spirits. The best way to describe them, they were maybe about 3 to 5 inches tall, and they kind of had oblong faces. There were 2 or 3 of these guys on this guy's shoulder, and they were actually arguing with each other and screaming in this guy's ear. As they were talking to him, he was shouting. You know how drunk people talk? I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Nelson claimed that these entities were wearing older-style, tattered, torn clothes. They just really kind of freaked me out, and they seen me. They looked at each other, and then they looked at me again, and they were talking. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. And then they looked at me again. I really started getting freaked out by this. Their eyes were dark. There were no retinas, no nothing, just black, little black eyes. And then they started talking into this woman's ear, and then she started talking loud. Nelson began to question what he was seeing, even striking up a conversation with the bartender, if only to ground himself in the moment. He reasoned that he must have had too much to drink, and he promptly left the establishment. I don't think I know what I seen that night, he admitted to Schrader. I hadn't really heard any reports like this at the time. It reminded me of the angel and the devil on the shoulder, conveying conscience and temptation, a plot device used in cartoons, literature, and in movies, though the entities observed by Nelson were not in keeping with that. Rather, they appeared to be tiny black-eyed beings wearing tattered clothes. To Nelson, they just freaked him out. At the time, I just filed this away as a really bizarre account and never really thought much about it after that, until I stumbled across a weird report from a 1992 issue of Strange magazine, issue 10, in an article titled Kashiri. A woman claims that in 1977, she was working as a cashier at a local casino. Magazine editor Mark Travinsky opted to not include her location in the report, possibly at her request. Anyway, she and everyone else at the casino would avoid a certain co-worker due to how strange she was. She talked about how she could see demons everywhere, and she talked to herself all the time. She would swing her hands in the air around her head and say, "Get away," or "Leave me alone," and looked like she was waving a fly away from her head. Of course, there was nothing there. One evening, the witness was waiting to get off work at 11 p.m. but became concerned when her relief failed to show up. That is when her supervisor informed her that she had called in sick and that they were going to have the, quote, crazy woman come and relieve her. They had to get her out of the coffee shop as she was having another one of her attacks. She finally showed up and procedure called for her to count my bank, and I had to stay in the booth with her as she counted the money. This is when things went from strange to totally off the rails. As she was doing this, she was talking to herself and would stop counting the money to shoo away whatever was flying around her head and yelling for it to leave her alone. Of course, I was embarrassed for her and felt sorry for her, but I didn't look at her for a few seconds. Then I couldn't resist. I glanced over at her, and to my amazement and shock, there was this little being floating in the air. It was definitely human looking only in the head and face. The rest of the body was like smoke. It looked male to me, so I will say he from now on. He had a sneer on his face, and hate and anger showed through his eyes and sneer. He was throwing himself at her head, and she would in response throw her hand up like shooing a fly and say, "Leave me alone." I thought my jaw fell on the floor. I closed my eyes and rubbed them, and opened them again to see if I had really seen what I saw, and it was still there, throwing itself at her with a vengeance. I could feel the hate, and as I stared at it, I started to say, "Leave her alone." I was thinking it when all of a sudden it looked at me with surprise in his eyes and vanished. The witness claims that she was in complete shock and started to scream, but stopped herself, tried to calm down. She asked if she could leave the room and told the woman that she trusted her to count down her bank. The woman agreed. I went straight to my supervisor and told her what happened. She looked at me and said, "Thank God." I thought I was crazy, because she had seen two of these small people sitting on the crazy lady's shoulder, talking together like two old buddies. She couldn't hear what they were saying, and no one else had or could see them, but her and now me.